We have attendees in the audience, so it is 11 o'clock on the dot, so we will get started. Excellent. Well, welcome. Thank you all for coming to the U.S. Circular Economy Coalition's first webinar in what's to be a series. Today, we'll be doing a broad overview to discuss efforts to reduce waste and emissions in various sectors, while also highlighting current efforts to incentivize waste reduction with support from the U.S. Department of Energy. In future webinars, we're going to be diving into a number of different topics from transportation, consumer packaged goods. The topics are myriad, as broad as our economy. So our economy right now is at an inflection point as we begin to retool how we deal with waste from inception to manufacturing to distribution and finally to end of life. These are critical considerations to reduce the impact on our environment and build a more resilient economy that prioritizes climate and waste considerations. With that, I'd like to introduce the U.S. Circular Economy Coalition Board Chair, Mike Van Brunt, who is also the Vice President of Environment and Sustainability at ReWorld Waste, for some opening and introductory remarks.
Great. Thank you very much, Sean, and thanks for the introduction. And thanks for everybody sort of attending today. This is sort of an exciting moment for us. This has been something that's been in the works for a while, and really excited to kick off this webinar series. As I think many people are seeing, we're seeing this sort of, both in the United States and across the globe, sort of a growing interest in the circular economy. There's been a lot of great conversation on a theoretical standpoint, a lot of great coverage even in the press, which is really calling attention to a lot of really critical issues for our world and society around waste, how we manage materials, and the intersection of those topics with environmental impact, social impact, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions. And now we're starting to see how we can advance the circular economy, move forward with more circular processes for managing waste and materials into real, tangible environmental and social benefits to our communities that we work in, as well as to the environment more broadly. And when we think just from the topic of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, depending on which estimate you look at, anywhere between 40 and 50% of emissions are wrapped up in the procurement, processing, delivery, and end-of-life management of waste and materials. So if we can do better with how we manage those waste and materials, it can deliver really transformative change to our ability to reach our climate goals as a country and as a society. At the same time, we're seeing a lot more attention around issues like methane. Methane is a key issue in the waste materials world because of what happens at the end of life with biodegradable materials in landfill. So as that spotlight is being shown on methane as being emitted at greater rates from landfills than we thought previously, as well as having a real big impact in the short term, which has a big impact on whether or not we can meet those 2050 climate goals, that becomes a really important dimension for us that we can leverage. However, what we're seeing a lot of times here in the circular economy world is that we need more practiced, practical, experienced voices at the table with the government, with Department of Energy, which we're excited to have them joining us today, also with policymakers at the state level and the federal government level, to really build on what's already working, build on the work that many companies, many of the practitioners out in the world are achieving, and leverage that into sort of policies, regulations that government can help craft that help us advance the circular economy more broadly, but do so in ways that have meaningful benefit to the environment and society. So again, thank you all for joining. And just one last thing I do want to touch on. One of the early things that the Circular Economy Coalition is going to be working on is a survey of existing federal government programs. So along the lines of building on what we have already, we are undertaking a survey of what the federal government is doing, both from a regulation standpoint, program standpoint, that helps support circularity, either by name or sometimes not even by name. So different aspects of the government that sort of advance circularity without us even really calling attention to it. And we hope that this will become an annual report that we then can sort of track progress, both from a policy standpoint, and also serve as a way of information sharing between the people, members of the CEC, as well as with government leaders. So with that, welcome, and I'd like to turn it back over to Sean.
Thank you, Mike. Much appreciated. I'll now turn to Jeray Carlson, who's the Senior Vice President of Sustainability, Communications, and Public Affairs at CEMEX, to introduce herself.
Thank you, Sean. Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Jeray Carlson. I am with CEMEX. It is a global building materials company. We manufacture cement and concrete and aggregates, and we also offer urbanization solutions. We believe that the circular economy is key to having a win-win-win for industry, environment, economy, and our society as well. Our approach at CEMEX is to maximize the use of non-recyclable waste that can be used either as a fuel or an additional raw material input into our manufacturing processes. We focus on byproducts from other industrial processes as well, and also construction, demolition, and excavation waste. We believe that having a circular economy driven by policy and supportive regulatory environments is key to help really leverage the interrelatedness among all of us, because someone's output can be someone else's input. And while there is a lot of great work going on in the recycling and recovery space, we do believe that with some additional policy tweaks and building out a more robust, comprehensive framework, we can really work together and leverage all of the benefits available to us through a circular economy model.
Thank you, Jeray. And I'll now turn to Zach Valdez, an advisor in the Department of Energy, and to the Office of Manufacturing and Supply Chains.
Yeah, thanks, Sean, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak here. I'm hoping to provide more of a broad overview of how the Manufacturing Energy Supply Chain Office, or MES, and DOE writ large is really looking at the various technology readiness levels, or how we are shaping sort of circularity for now and what the future brings, so that we have a thought process not only for the renewable energies, but a lot of the resources that go into creating those renewable energies, and how we are looking at leveraging the unprecedented funding we have through this administration from bipartisan infrastructure law, Inflation Reduction Act, and even CHIPS, to understand what supply chains look like and where we can be effective in building domestic capabilities around circularity for those resources.
Thank you, Zach. Now let's get into the conversation. We have lots to cover, probably too much to talk about circularity in the time we are given today. So with the first question, this will be to everybody. How do you define success in circularity? Mike, I'll turn to you first.
That's a great question. I think probably one of the most pivotal ones, one that we wrestle with a lot, one that we wrestle a lot with our customers and clients. We view the circular economy as really a means to an end. And as we work with customers, and we're helping them sort of in their goals and advance their goals in building a more sustainable world, and reimagine the waste that they generate. And one of the things we're always asking ourselves and working with our clients and customers to ask is, what's the actual benefit that you're achieving through greater circularity? And I think it has to start there, because that's really what we're after. We're after sort of, how is this helping our community? How is this helping retain resources in our economy? And how is this helping to reduce environmental impacts? And it's important to be able to quantify that, even if it's an estimate, even if it's a preliminary estimate, to give you an idea if it really helps you make appropriate choices, informed decision-making, particularly when, we're competing with resources across the organizations and the companies that we work with.
Thank you, Mike. And I'll turn to you, Zach, now to give up some perspective from the Department of Energy.
Yeah, so I think DOE is a new entity, right? For everybody who may or may not be aware, we have transitioned from being mostly focused on research and development to now looking at what we call D&D, demonstration and deployment. So we're really looking at late stage commercialization capabilities. So depending on which side of the coin you're on, I think the R&D folks would tell you success in circularity means taking it from an idea, or taking it from paper to lab, or lab to bench scale, or bench scale to prototype. And so their idea is like, how do we build innovative technology here and create that technology? I think where MESC sits, which is on that Undersecretary for Infrastructure side, one of the ways that we identify success is through what this administration has deemed as Justice 40, which is making sure that the benefits of commercializing these circularity technologies really leans itself into supporting the communities in which it's based. And not only doing that, but leveraging the resources that we have. So a lot of our offices are focused on what are the domestic capabilities and capacities that we can create here to keep clean energy jobs and healthy communities at the forefront of how we think about building these circularity movements, and making sure that each individual technology is not only designed for circularity, but has a circularity component built within it.
Thank you, Zach. That's great perspective. Jure?
Yes, I believe that success would be developing a very comprehensive and compatible regulatory and policy environment that allows us to maximize the opportunities that are already available to us and leverage materials that are already out there in the environment. There are a lot of value that can be assessed to those materials that can be inputs into different processes. And at the same time, it can reduce landfill volumes, which that also serves the benefit of minimizing potential risks of damage to the soil or maybe water in the area, and also cleaning up communities. There's just a lot of opportunity that we see and that we pursue as a company, and even in the cement industry. We've been using circular principles for decades, and we just still feel that we need to modify the environment in which we're operating and really view it as an economic model. It is environmental, it is social, but there are economies around it. And if we really activate all of the possibilities in a circular economy, new businesses will pop up, new economies will come together, offering those new jobs, and as we transition to cleaner energy environment. So I would love to see an environment where we're able to continue doing what we're doing, but with a little bit of adjustment, open up new pathways, and also continually allow for innovation that would come. So we believe, minimizing our own waste output, reusing waste from other streams. And I will say that when I'm talking about waste in this context, I'm not using the term waste in a regulatory definition. It's just general common understanding, our household waste, industrial waste, just aspects of production that is left over. And we need to make sure that we seize the opportunity to recover the energy that's in those products and recycle them back and to keep them into the economy as long as possible.
Thank you,
I just want
Jure.
to jump in. Sorry, Sean. I mean, I think, Jure, you just made a really good point about regulatory definitions of waste and how, that often can be an impediment or a challenge with how we look at things at the end of life. We have, and it's not even just regulations, it's even just like quality standards that we have in place for different materials. It's like we sort of grew up our industry in sort of a presumption of, we dig a fresh material out of the ground and it's material X, and standards got developed around that. And sometimes these standards are very well entrenched, and then all of a sudden you're dealing with recycled inputs or reused inputs, and it can be a very different game. We still have very little risk or no risk to human health and the environment, but you've entrenched these sort of regulatory and technical standard and industry standards that preclude us from doing a little bit better job with waste materials at their end of life, completely, in many cases, not intentionally. And so part of, I think, what we want to do with the Circular Economy Coalition is to help us identify some of those roadblocks so that we don't have to be so careful with how we frame things and what terms we use, and focus more on bringing that value back into the economy.
That's excellent insight. Thank you, Jure and Mike. And that kind of brings us to the next question, which again will be a question for all, but it's about putting circularity into practice. And what would you implement to build a circular economy? And specifically, how would you put that into practice? And Mike, I'll let you kick that off again, and then we'll turn to Jure and Zach.
I think markets are critical. Without having a market for those materials, it's really difficult to sort of, capitalize on that value at end of life. And sometimes those markets need a little bit of help. We're not so great at recognizing externalities, both in terms of end of life management and different options, and some of those can be very positive and negative. So sometimes some of those markets need a little bit of support to get off the ground.
Thank you, Jeray.
I agree with everything that Mike said. I think that a more robust and comprehensive waste management hierarchy, as we see in other parts of the world, in Europe, for example, where they have a waste management hierarchy that sets forth the manner in which materials are to be dealt with, so that you essentially get the highest, best use from them and maximize their value. And if we could see that develop here in the US, I believe that it would really give life to those economies. The economies would spring forward. There's so many areas in our country where you don't have basic recycling. The facilities are not there. They do take money and investment. They take employees. And when you develop a comprehensive framework that values the inputs and can help incentivize and redirect where they go, then it's almost like if you build it, they will come. The markets will follow a circular economy framework driven by a great waste management hierarchy.
Thank you. Zach?
Yeah, and I think like moving from that waste management hierarchy is really just trying to understand what the supply chain looks like, and understanding from cradle to grave, right? Where are we at with all the resources that we have available, and what's the value that we can inject into them? One of the areas that I think DOE has traditionally done a really good job is supporting innovation in areas that have high risk. Right. So making sure that we're de-risking some of those capital investments before they get to the market, so that universities and labs can really think about how to develop some of these circularity processes. What our office at MESC is really looking at is like, what are existing technologies that we can scale and reduce some of that capital expenditure to build those capabilities. So from a deployment lens, which is where our office sits, we want to think about not only what do those supply chains look like, so what is the resource availability, but what existing technology can we implement or distribute at this point that has a scaling property where we, at the Department of Energy, may invest $10, but it has a $100 impact on the economy, on the sector, to really support that market viability that we need to latch on for both the consumer and the person who's developing that practice. So we want to look at all the routes and the processes and the designs around circularity, so that we make sure that when we do make those investments at a deployment level, they have long-term sustainability, both in terms of the circularity process, but also just as importantly in terms of a business and caring for their stakeholders.
Thank you, Zach. Mike, do you see anything in aggregate markets that reflects some of these risk-based and reasonable projects that Zach has highlighted?
I think it's a challenge in the aggregate markets, because I think it's a very, sort of traditional market, aggregate, and I think Jeray can speak to this too, is like, they're just about huge volumes and efficiencies. And, we have also customers that we work with a lot that are very sort of, they look for, they're used to dealing with this particular supplier. So I think there's a lot of, help that can be done in sort of the aggregate markets to kind of get them to look maybe a little bit more expansively, maybe look at smaller, market sources. If you're used to dealing with a quarry, for example, and you're sourcing literally thousands or tens of thousands of tons of aggregate from that quarry, and then you've got us that's able to make sort of an aggregate product out of our energy recovery process that might be working in the order of like 100 times or, per week or something to that effect. It takes it's a little bit hard, you have to do work to sort of crack that nut. I mean, it certainly can. And I think I like to see some of the things that we're seeing happen around sort of the construction industry, as really positive in terms of environmental product declarations and sort of the encouragement of reuse. I think those type of things are helping to build some of that market, sort of draw and recognize some of those externalities, which is, I think, proven to be helpful. Jerry, I don't know if you had anything else to add.
Thank you, Mike. So we are seeing more interest in recycled aggregates. And one thing that we have been doing is that we have returned concrete. Some people may not be familiar with the ready mix process, but when you see the mixer drums rolling on the highway, that's concrete, not cement. The cement is the powder that goes into the concrete. But sometimes, often, when you deliver concrete, you have a residual in the drum. Sometimes it's because the customer didn't need as much as they ordered, but there's always some residual in the drum and it has to be cleaned out. Otherwise it would harden and ruin the drum. So we have been managing, just as ordinary business practice, you have to manage your return concrete and some of the washout of that material. But that material can be used as an alternative aggregate for road base, for example. And also with construction and demolition debris, you can recover. There's a variety of inputs into this construction and demolition waste space, from concrete, asphalt, brick, steel, timber. There's a lot of types of material that can be recovered through the demolition process. And with respect to the concrete, we are able to recover that and separate some of the aggregates in there from the binding agent, and then use some of the binding agent as an input into the cement production process. So we're continuing to keep that loop going. We're also able to make new concrete, fresh concrete, with a portion of recycled aggregate. So we are seeing trends toward trying to incentivize reuse of construction materials, and we believe it's the direction that we're headed. We just hope that we can move it along, and through this coalition, we're hopeful that we can help spotlight the opportunities and the innovations that are available to help us progress more quickly.
It's such a great example of circularity in action. I remember when we first spoke of that, and there was just light bulbs went off, and I was really excited to see CEMEX is undertaking that, because there is so much waste in the construction industry, and being able to utilize some of that leftovers in such an innovative way is really fantastic. And that's what we want to see more across the entire economy in various sectors, is how do we build innovative approaches to utilize that leftover material, whether it's remanufacturing, whether it's utilizing leftovers, et cetera. But that gets us to the next point. And that's kind of the other side of recycled materials, and that's landfilling. And this question I'm going to turn to Zach first. And how does the Department of Energy view landfilling, and what efforts is the agency undertaking to reduce waste across the economy?
Yeah, and even stepping one step back to talk with Jerry, I mean, it's how do we incentivize all those companies to think about the resources that they have and the opportunities that are already existing, and really support them. And so it really isn't all of a government approach as we think about, what efforts we do to reduce waste across the economy, considering landfilling. And so Interior may have a different policy than Energy, which may have a different policy than EPA. And so we all have sort of our own set statutes based on the agencies and the capabilities that we have. But I think at a project level, or a program level, we have individual values. So our office in particular may be looking at something like the battery critical materials supply chain and trying to identify, what does circularity look like for that? Do we design the battery so that it is easily recyclable? Or do we put materials into those batteries that we're able to pull out? And so we want to make sure that not only do we work with DOE to create programs that support circularity, either directly or indirectly, right? So you're going to be manufacturing a battery. We want to know, what's the offtake agreement after that battery is spent, right? Just for example, but you could use this for any sort of product resource. And so we take that into consideration when we think about how we're funding different programs, and also thinking about what is the long-term engagement with the community, the impacts that circularity will have with that community. So really thinking about if we're going to be increasing waste to certain areas or certain communities, what impact will that have, and how can we mitigate that through program design, so that from the very beginning, companies are thinking about circularity and reducing waste in their design.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. That's it also harkens back to your previous comments about the Justice 40 and the impacts, and where those impacts are felt and where the benefits can also be achieved. Before I jump to the next question, Mike, was there something you wanted to add on to that, or did I? Sorry, never mind. Before I jump to the next question, I do want to flag we'll have a brief moment for Q&A at the end of the webinar. So I see a question or two popping up below. We will get to those, and we'll make sure we get those answered. So thank you for submitting them. And if you have them in the meantime, please feel free to drop them into the chat for Q&A, and we'll add them to the queue. This next question is for Mike and Jeray. How does ReWorld Waste and CEMEX embody the principles of circularity specifically, and how are you working to reduce waste and landfilling? Jeray, you spoke a little bit about your effort specifically on using that leftover concrete, but broadly as a company, are there any programs, initiatives that you guys are also working on?
Yes. So, we believe that the cement industry is uniquely situated to really contribute to the circular economy. So I spoke earlier about concrete and some of the efforts we have there, but if we take it back to looking along our entire value chain, right now we are in some of our aggregate quarries, we are using alternative fuels in our yellow iron in the quarries, and in some of our ready-mix fleet as well, where renewable diesel is made from waste oils. They are recovered and processed into a renewable diesel, which is a drop-in fuel. It does not require a lot of investment in replacing your engines or charging stations and refilling stations. It's a very simple yet very impactful mechanism that we are using where it is available to us. It's not available in a lot of places. Part of the reason why it's available to us in California in particular is because they have a low carbon fuel standard, and that helps level out the economics of it. But it's a great transitional move for us just in our aggregates and other transportation vehicles. In the cement manufacturing process, we can use alternative fuels that are not fossil fuel based to heat our kiln. When you produce cement, about 60% of the emissions come from the chemical composition and transition from limestone into clinker, but there's also 40% that is combustion emissions. We are able to use non-recyclable materials that we feed into the kiln for the combustion process, but depending on what those materials are, they may also contribute to our raw material inputs. So not only are we diverting waste that might otherwise end up in the landfill to be used for their energy recovery, but it can also supplement raw material inputs. One of the values of that is that the biogenic factor of those materials, if they were to be landfilled, would decompose and release methane, and that's significantly more impactful than other greenhouse gases, particularly in the first 20 years or so of life. So we are helping to avoid those emissions and using it as we create our cement. We also can use industrial byproducts, slag from steel and fly ash from coal, for example, to help blend with our clinker as we are making cement. And since those have already been through a production process and are decarbonized, when we substitute that for clinker, we are diluting the carbon intensity in our cement. We can also use those materials at the further down the value chain at our concrete plants to help achieve specification, strength, and durability requirements. But it gives us a lot of flexibility on how we get optimize our products if we're able to utilize those materials and also reduce our CO2 footprint. Those are just a few of the ways that we are, using the circular economy and those principles, and also, the manner that I spoke of earlier about concrete, but we're looking at innovations as well to, look for other opportunities.
Thanks, Dre. I'll turn to you now, Mike.
Yeah, this is where our worlds collide a little bit, Dre. So we do very similarly. We're in sort of our rekiln offering. We do very similar for some of our customers in terms of taking different waste materials that we can use and process into fuels for cement kilns. And it's been kind of a relatively new business line for us for the last few years, but one that we're really excited about because it really kind of helps, I think, draw that connection between the end of life of one set of industries and providing alternative fuels for your industry and other lime kilns and even the pulp and paper industry. And it's also, I think, opened up a little bit sort of optionality for us, because one of the things that our traditional, what we call our thermal mechanical treatment facilities, those are sort of geared around sort of managing regular waste. And then when we start looking at sort of the industrial and commercial waste markets, the properties of those wastes can be very different. A lot of times those wastes can have very high BTU content, which is not as good for one of our traditional facilities, one of our thermal mechanical treatment facilities, but it's great for application in like a kiln environment because you have that high BTU content, relatively low moisture content. And I think that sort of underscores how important it is to have a variety of different outlets, alternatives, and markets kind of working together. I think it's, sometimes I like to think of it not as a circular economy, but almost like a web, almost in terms of interdependency. And one of the projects that we've always been really excited about, and it's just added another dimension recently, is in our Niagara Falls facility. We work very closely with a major recycled paperboard manufacturer. And when we think about it, it's like, they bring in just, truckloads of bales of paper. And those bales of paper can start off in your household. They can start off in businesses. They can contain up to 30% contamination. And that's a contamination in terms of, unrecyclable paperboard, plastic that gets mixed in the recycled markets. They can't make new paper out of that. That all has to get sorted out of their process. We take that material and are actually able to recover energy from it, which we direct back into the paper making process in the form of steam. So that particular mill doesn't have a fossil fuel boiler at all. It's completely reliant on the steam supply that we're able to supply by capturing the energy value left over, not only after their waste, but other waste and materials that we bring at the end of life. And then another part of our organization actually generates an animal bedding product out of the paper mill sludge. So certain parts of the paper mill sludge make an excellent animal bedding product. It's biodegradable, so it degrades when it's put out into the agricultural system. It's a great solution for local farmers, and sort of showcases how you can have sort of that confluence of recycling, energy recovery, reuse opportunity, all in the same area. And one of the things that we've been trying to do over time to help kind of drive ourselves internally toward this, we've wrestled with this for a long time. It's like, how do you get, our customers and even ourselves internally to focus on circularity things, which at first take a little bit more effort to get done. And they always do. And that's why it's great to hear about like the efforts of the DOE and the government, and how do you help incentivize looking at things a little bit differently. When we went private a few years ago, EQT purchased us, which is a very sort of well-known sustainability focused private equity firm. They did that purchasing. They were very sort of interested in doing it through what's called sustainability linked financing. And so we struggled with what that should look like. And ultimately it decided around a waste hierarchy approach. And so we set 2 targets for ourselves, which are directly linked to the cost of our financing. If we don't make our targets, we face an interest rate risk of 25 basis points for each target that we don't miss. We have 2 targets. Those are centered around growing sustainable waste management, and more specifically, growing by 25% relative to a 2020 baseline, reuse, recycling, composting, sort of what we call our up the waste hierarchy tons. And it has been amazing to see how much focus that creates within our business units. They want to know is like, how are we doing relative to our targets? It's now created sort of incentives internally with the organization for our salespeople and our client services teams to sort of look for opportunities that we can think a little bit more broadly, not only think about how do we recover energy, but then also how do we do material recovery. So it's been a great way for us to kind of connect what our sustainability ambitions are together with what our financial structure is, and really put meaningful signal right directly in our financials that the sustainability is core to what we want to try to do as a company.
Thanks, Mike. Zach, following up on Jeray and Mike's comments, how does the DOE look at decarbonization and finding resources for cleaner products?
Yeah, so there was an entire liftoff report released in the last year on sort of the decarbonization technologies, whether it be for cement, steel, chemicals, pulp and paper, aluminum, glass, that really provided a very broad brush strokes, right? It didn't give answers, but it did say these are the known knowns. What I think we're looking at now is how do we partner with industry in this new area of industrial strategy? We're looking for really something that is industry-led and government-enabled. And so we want to see where does it make sense, both in the terms of like philosophically, but also in terms of economically, for them to adopt circular opportunities. And so whether that is looking at various forms of energy efficiency or recycling raw material substitutions or clinker, in these cases, I think we're trying to identify what makes the most economic sense and what does the best job in decarbonization. And we are moving towards leveraging both our internal analysis, both at MESC across all the offices in the agency, and our national labs to really identify what does the market look like and what are the resource availabilities. But also moving to the area where we're asking for industry input. Are we getting this analysis right? Because ultimately what it does is it informs how we design programs so that when we are making that next step in commercialization, we have the insights of industry to tell us where we're aligned and where we may be not hitting the mark or shooting for the stars.
Thank you, Zach. That's excellent perspective once again. We are approaching 40 minutes in, and I want to make sure we get time to get some Q&A. We've had a couple questions submitted. The first was by Cherise Petker, and she asked, how should circular economy project owners go about submitting our solutions for collaboration to expedite scale? And I think this was in response to some comments you made earlier in the conversation, Zach. Do you want to take the first stab at that question?
So it was, how can circular economy communities help to build scale?
Project owners submit solutions for collaboration to expedite scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think Mike actually said it really well. It's less of like a it's more of a like a network. It's more of a spider web in terms of how we think about circularity. So the more you're aware of what your inputs and outputs are, the better you are able to measure where you can save on resource efficiency. And I think for the Department of Energy, we want to see that you are aware of like both from like a supply chain standpoint, like where your product is or your component or your resource, but also looking at it from like a geographic standpoint. How close are you to these things to reduce sort of the scope 3 emissions, etc. And then the last one would be, as I think they're getting to, is like, how are you investing in the community and making sure that they are bought in on the process and they are involved in the process. So I would say as you build these relationships, that's really important, because what we at DOE are now looking at is something called community benefits plans, which not only showcases are you providing good jobs and working with the community, but also looking at like how involved are you as a member of a larger cohort. And the more buy-in you have to your product, the more partners you have. It shows us that you have a strong relationship that we feel more comfortable funding, because relationships ultimately are what keep projects alive. And we hope that as you build those out, it sort of snowballs into a bigger impact.
That's perfect. Thank you, Zach. And we have another question from Shatha Akun. Measuring and monitoring the transition towards a circular economy utilizes a set of indicators to quantify progress, inform decision-making, and enhance investments in circular business models. Some of these indicators include circular business models, social activities, and innovation. Which models have been the most successful in the US from a business perspective, and can these models be adapted for SMEs? And I think I'll turn to Mike and Jure for some insight on this question.
Well, that's good. It's a good question. I mean, I think, one of the challenges is always how do you equate sometimes very different impacts from a particular project? I mean, because we're not only are we looking sort of at traditional environmental indicators. I mean, you can look at sort of traditional air emissions, eutrophication, water quality issues, climate change. And then you're also, I think, as we've heard from Zach, and I think you've sort of outlined in your question, you've got that social dimension to it as well. So I think, the easy answer is you've got to sort of address you got to take a multidisciplinary approach. You've got to address sort of the social impacts. You have to address the local community. I loved and wrote down, Zach's line that relationships keep projects alive. That's critical and really important. We always kind of think about our local community as sort of, they're stakeholders in our processes. So you have to look at sort of the circular economy that way as well. But then also, keep in context, and you're dealing with very sort of hyper local issues, but then you're also dealing with global issues. So then you have to bridge that to climate change and making sure that you're sort of capturing that too. What that eventual model looks like, I think is this, and this is where it gets really complicated. It's going to depend on your particular project and what the objectives are of your stakeholders.
Thank you, Mike. Jure, did you want to add anything to that?
I'll just add a few other comments. It all is going to be project specific. It depends on what is available to you, what is the delta in your emissions or whatever attributes you're looking at to improve, waste reduction. In some areas, your goal may be to, waste can go from being an expense to an income stream in some respects. We have a plant in Europe where approximately 70% of the combustion fuels they use were from non-fossil alternative fuels. And when I used that example earlier, I was speaking in terms of landfill diversion being sent to kilns for fuel, but there is a process that goes through it. It goes through, Mike mentioned it earlier. What is the BTU value? What is the moisture content? What is the stability of the supply, the proximity? There's technological feasibility analysis, emissions reduction analysis, economic analysis. And when we do utilize these programs or projects, we, in terms of the social aspects of it, we speak with our community members. We want them to be aware and educated. Unfortunately, we feel that there is some misinformation around the usage of alternative fuels, for example, as around the coal combustion residuals, the fly ash or the slag sometimes. And we believe that there's unnecessary fear mongering, for lack of a better word. Our cement plants are very sophisticated in terms of the environmental protection mechanisms. It's a very stringent regulatory environment. So we want our neighbors and our employees to understand that our use of these materials is not subjecting them to harmful impacts. We also want to look at the benefit of getting some of those things out of their environment. So on the fly ash, there are, I don't know how many sites around the US where fly ash has been ponded, and it's there and it's in the environment, and it's not serving a valuable purpose. However, if it could be extracted and utilized, it could, its value to different people in the ecosystem could be realized, but also reduce the potential environmental or social risks for those communities. So, as Mike said, it's very comprehensive review. We also look in terms of our CO2 impacts, and does it move the needle? Does the reduction in emissions warrant that particular investment? So the programs that the DOE is offering can really help de-risk projects for us and others, and we're very happy that they have the IIJA and the other mechanisms and the focus for moving. Yeah, we still think that research and development from the DOE, because they are such a credible body and a credible voice, that is necessary to help our stakeholders understand the value in what we're doing, but also to help get those projects implemented and advanced.
Thank you, Jeray. And with that, I'm going to let that be the last word. We are at the end of the line here. I want to thank sincerely our panelists, Jeray, Zach, and Mike, for joining us today. We're incredibly excited for the trajectory of the U.S. Circular Economy Coalition. There's so much more to discuss, and that's why we're going to be having lots more of these webinars on a myriad of topics. So once again, thank you, panelists, for joining us, and thank you, audience, for taking the time out of your day to join us today, submitting your questions. Please stay in touch with us. Connect with us on LinkedIn or on our website, uscecoalition.org. And until then, we'll stay tuned, and please reach out. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.